Nagtitiwala ako sa Diyos, nagtitiwala ako sa sambayan ng Pilipino.
Lalaban ako. Lalaban tayo.
Iisa ang hangarin, iisa ang mithiin. Leniki ko lumaban para sa taong bayan. Tagos na pagkalinga, ang handog ay biyaya. Leniki ko lumaban, tayo ay di iniwan. Ano man ang unos, leniki ko naman. Alagang lubos, leniki ko naman. Magkasamang lakas, alay ay wagas, leniki ko laban. Umaraw man bumagyo, leniki ko naman. Tayo ang panalo, leniki ko naman. Haharapin, sabay aabutin, turok ng tagumpay. Ano man ang unos, leniki ko naman. Alagang lubos, leniki ko naman. Magkasamang lakas, alay ay wagas, leniki ko laban. Umaraw man bumagyo, leniki ko naman. Tayo ang panalo, leniki ko naman. Haharapin, sabay aabutin, turok ng tagumpay. Leniki ko laban. Leniki ko laban. Leniki ko laban.
Hindi ko lang naman to laban eh. Parang laban ito ng mga tao sa amin. Nag-umpisa kami, walang-wala talaga. Pero there were people na tumataya na kahit mukhang wala pa akong kapag-apag-asa. Pero gaya ng dati, ano lang, tiwala lang, sipag lang. Ang nagmamahal, kailangang ipaglaban ang minamahal. Lalaban ako. Lalaban tayo.
Huwag kang mabahala, ikaw ay mahalaga. Hindi kita pababayaan. Hindi tayo naiiba at sana'y paniwala ang napipiliin kaaraw-araw. At alam ko ang aking kaya, alam ko ang hindi, alam ko ang kailangan upang makapagsilbi. Hanggat may kabutihan, hanggat may pag-ibig, liwanag ang mananaig. At hindi ko may papangako ang kulay rosas na mundo para sa'yo. At hindi ko mailawan ang lahat ng anino. Pero sisigapin ko at hindi ako magpapahinga hanggat hindi mo pa magawang muling ipagmalaki na ika'y isa. Pilipino. Huwag kang matatakot, may kasangga ka sa laban na ito. Sabay natin
Hindi alam ko ang kailangan upang makapagsilbi. Hanggat may kabutihan, hanggat may pag-ibig, liwanag ang mananaig. At hindi ko may papangako ang kulay rosas na mundo para sa'yo. At hindi ko may ilawan ang lahat ng anino, pero sisikapin ko at hindi ako magpapahinga hanggat hindi mo pa magawang muling ipagmalaki na ika'y isang Pilipinong may pusong sagutin ang tugon, Pilipinong may tapang na muling bumangon, Pilipinong buo ang paninindigan, alam ang tama at totoo. Samahan mo ako. At hindi may papangako ang rosas na mundo para sa'yo. At hindi ko mailawan ang lahat ng anino, pero sisikapin ko at hindi ako magpapahinga hanggat hindi mo pa magawang muling ipagmalaki na ika'y isang matatag at matapang at mabuti at mapagmahal na Pilipino. Pilipino. Pilipino.
Kailangan nating palayain ang sarili mula sa kasalukuyang sitwasyon. Lalaban ako. Lalaban tayo.
Puno ng takot at kaba, kailan matatapos ating pagluha? Marami ang nawalan ng trabaho't mahal sa buhay, isang malungkot na balita. Ngunit hindi tayo mayayanig. Isang bayan at Lenny tutulong, basta't sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan. Ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno, nasan ka man, Lenny Robredo tayo. Marami na ang gumaling, salamat sa mga bayaning tumulong. Walang takot lumalaban, alay ang buhay sa pagsagip. Isang magandang balita, hinding-hindi tayo papayanig. Isang bayan at Lenny tutulong, basta't sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan. isang matibay na kahit banggain, hindi kayang buwagin, hindi kayang buwagin. Sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan, ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno, nasan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan, ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno, nasan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Sabay-sabay, walang mang-iiwan, ikaw at ako, tayo ay Pilipino. Ating dasal, tapat na pinuno, nasan ka man, Leni Robredo tayo. Tapat na pinuno, tapat na Pilipino, Leni Robredo tayo.
Tawagin po natin si Governor Dinugundo para sa ating opening prayer.
Marami pong salamat at magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Tayo po ngayon ay manalangin, mga kapatid. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Unlike Jabez's father who wanted his borders enlarged, we are asking you, Father, to preserve our territorial waters and its fullness. This is the country you have given us, Filipinos, and it would be a betrayal of your gift and generosity if we are to give it up and not say anything or do anything about it. Lord, we remember what you said to your people Israel to journey from Egypt to Canaan, the promised land, and possess the land. We have the possession of our territories. Thanks to the Lord our God. We shall fight for it, and we shall stand our ground. Help us, Father. Continue to embolden us and empower us. Because we know you and your word, we shall be firm and steadfast, and we shall do great exploits for the Lord our God. Continue to bless, Lord, One Sambayan and the rest of the Filipino community in fighting, Lord God, for our rights and our sovereignty. Thank you, Father, in Jesus' mighty name. Amen and amen. Praise God. Praise God.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Bayang magiliw, perlas ng silanganan, halap ng puso, sa titig mo'y buhay. Upang hinirang, tuyang ka ng magiting, sa manlulupin, di ka pasisiin, sa dagat at bundok, sa simulan, sa langit mong bughaw, may dilagang tumatapit sa paglayang minamahal. Pag-islap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagniningning, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Araw naman, kahit pagsinta, mo'y langit sa piling mo. Pag-kayanapan ay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Isang napakaganda at kulay na rosas na Friday sa inyong lahat. Nagbabalik na naman po tayo sa ating serye ng Tapatan Media Forum ng Isang Bayan. Isang malaking hello po sa inyo, mga kaisang bayan na sumusubaybay sa atin sa FB Live at sa YouTube live stream. At binabati din natin ang ating mga kapatid sa media na walang sawang uma-attend ng ating talakayan dito. Ang paksa ngayong araw ay tungkol sa West Philippine Sea at kung ano ang aasahan natin sakaling manalo ang anak ng diktador na si Marcos Jr. Maraming beses na niyang inihayag sa media na tila hindi na niya ipaglalaban ng ating claim sa West Philippine Sea dahil ayon sa kanya, matatalo lang tayo sa China. Tama ba ito? Hindi ba dapat ang posisyon ng isang magiging pangulo ng bansa ang basta lamang isuko ang ating karapatan sa ating teritoryo? Ano ba dapat ang policy na tatahakin ng susunod na Pangulo sa usapin ng ating claim sa West Philippine Sea? Makakasama natin ngayong araw sa ating tapatan sina Professor Renato De Castro na nagtuturo ng International Studies at consultant ng National Security Advisor. Makakasama rin natin ang ating lead convener na si retired Supreme Court Justice Antonio Carpio. So, simulan na natin ang ating tapatan. Professor De Castro, you have the floor now.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me express my pleasure and honor to be given an opportunity again to be a resource person for Sambayan. But before I start, let me make some clarification. Number one, I was a consultant of the National Security Advisor during the Aquino administration. I would like to emphasize this. On the day that my boss, the National Security Advisor, General Cesar Garcia, resigned from his position, I also joined him. So I'm not part of the National Security Council of this administration. And second point, I would like to first express my my acknowledgement of two individuals who have guided me. Number one, of course, is Justice Carpio, who has been providing me this very important, mentoring as a disciple in terms of advancing the cause of the West Philippine Sea. And the other one was my former teacher in the University of the Philippines in Manila, who taught me very important lesson as a student. And that's no less than Governor Diwa Ginigundo, who probably could not anymore remember me because he was my teacher in Econ 101. And he instilled that, really habit of taking my classes seriously, which I carried way into my grad school. Okay. Let me now do my presentation. I have a PowerPoint presentation. So we are in the tail end of the campaign period. So we have had enough of, listening to what the candidates had said regarding what they will be their policy regarding the West Philippine Sea, regarding the policy in terms of our relationship with two great powers who are also involved in the West Philippine Sea dispute. And that's, of course, China and Russia, and, of course, the United States. Now, the campaign period is practically over. Now, I think what is important for us to focus on is what, this candidate, whoever he or she might be, if he or she wins the election, will have to do once they are in office. And of course, more importantly, what they will do will also depend on their character, their courage, and of course, their motivation to run. This is where the real action will be, not in terms of what they're saying at this point in time. So my focus would be, let's look at, the post-Duterte foreign policy administration. Is it simply a matter of saying what they will do to effect this change? Or more importantly, the challenges they will have to, this president will have to do once they are in office. And that is not in terms of changing, but of course, working hard on trying to achieve what I would call an equilibrium or a balance. Let me proceed. So during, of course, the campaign for the Philippine presidential election, candidates have, of course, had their opportunity to state their positions. Preference on how the country, and of course, this is in the light of President Duterte is about to step down. He will have to look for a new architect of our foreign policy by July 1, 2022. Philippine presidents are not, of course, what is been basically very apparent is that we tend to listen to what they're saying, ignoring the fact that once they get once the president, whoever would be, is elected, they will not be from internal and external constraint to pursue his or her foreign policy agenda, which of course he or she mentioned during in the campaign. Okay, the real issue in foreign policy is not changing foreign policy, despite concepts. We have heard this president saying, justifying all his actions, abrogating our treaty with the International Criminal Court, abrogating the visiting force agreement, simply on a very vague notion. I call it vague because it is a motherhood statement in our constitution, independent foreign policy, on a basis that using it. But of course, how the new president will have to find the appropriate balance in conducting Philippine foreign policy by addressing, this key issue of how do we have to balance our relationship with two great powers in the region, that's of course China and the United States. So during the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, she tried to have this balance, focusing on the war on terror, while at the same time beginning her effort to cultivate relationship with China, which put her into a lot of problems. By the end of her term, nobody trusts her. Not the United States, not China, because everyone is basically accepted the fact that you could not simply trust this lady who has a double dealer. President Benigno Aquino III tried to effect this balance. No, people have forgotten. Simply have to remember, what he did in Scarborough Shoal, the decision to sign EDCA in 2014, ignoring the fact at the onset of his term, he tried to balance our relationship with China. People had forgotten that the Aquino administration ordered our ambassador in Stockholm not to attend the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese blind dissident in 2010, because at that time we do not want to antagonize China. People had forgotten that when Hillary Clinton announced in July 2010 that the United States has an interest in the South China Sea dispute, the current foreign secretary at the time, Secretary Alberto Romulo, said, we don't want the United States to become involved in the South China Sea, basically parroting the Chinese position of resolving the issue bilaterally. Of course, his effort to find the right balance was sidelined by, of course, the fact that very assertive Chinese behavior. First, in the Reed Bank in March 2011, and more importantly, what happened in Scarborough Shoal. So this should have been a lesson for us that, there's a limit there. The main limit, whether, if, the son of the dictator would say, I would like to befriend China, Chinese are our best friend, we will always have to face the fact that China is always uncompromising when it comes to the territorial issues in the South China Sea. Of course, the notion of balancing was simply forgotten when President Duterte took over in 2016, when he said, we're moving towards Russia and China. So the need to seek this equilibrium disappeared. Like, like a mist in the early morning when you have this President Duterte taking over. He called for a dramatic shift in our policy from China, from away from the United States toward China, which of course led to the perception, erroneous perception, that foreign policy fluctuates every time you have a president taking over. Consequently, the prevailing assumption is there's no systemic guarantee of continuity from one administration from the next, so foreign policy changes when the president changes. The paramount issue actually when it comes to Philippine foreign policy is not the president pursuing his or her personal agenda, but in terms of the conduct of policy, but the conduct of foreign policy, but which involves the administration seeking the appropriate balance in dealing with the two major powers in the Indo-Pacific, China and the United States. So the test here, of course, when he or she takes the position, and this is where not what he or she would say, but this is where, of course, character would have to be taken into account. and of course, commitment in terms of his or her work. So let's just dwell on this, on the illusion of presidential preference in terms of foreign policy. Judging, of course, from the rhetorics right now, the idea that the elected president's view and preference eventually dictate the country's foreign policy is, of course, widely accepted. But of course, there are issues regarding, there are caveats regarding this. The popular belief is that whoever wins will determine how the Philippines will handle its territorial dispute with China in the West Philippine Sea and manage the country's alliance with the US in the context of the raging great power rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. This accounts for the fact that, in fact, almost all the candidates except one have basically called for a tougher position against China. Even, of course, Manny Pacquiao, who started earlier. You know, President Duterte even got angry at him when he told him, just focus on boxing, forget about foreign policy. Remember this? When he accused the President Duterte of being soft on China. All of them has basically come out with the same position. The importance of the tribunal in terms of supporting the Philippines' position in rejecting China's territorial claim, strengthening our country's alliance not only with the United States, but with other, of course, like-minded allies, and building up, of course, the country's territorial defense capability. Most have taken the similar positions. They all take, in a way, a centrist approach that, you know, aside from confronting China, we also have to take into account the possibility of joint development. Even Vice President Leni Robredo mentioned this. She said, yeah, we have to consider joint development, but with a caveat. China first must recognize the arbitral ruling. And of course, all of them called for strengthening of our military and defense ties, not only with Washington, but with Canberra, Tokyo, and of course, the member states of the European Union. And this is where the main issue comes in. We have only one candidate who stands for continuity of President Duterte's policy to China, and that's no less than the son of the former dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Marcos has stressed the futility of challenging an economic and military power as China, and of course the need to maintain a robust economic cooperation with China, despite of course China's effort to expand. Seems determined to set aside the arbitral ruling. He said erroneously that the ruling is not valid because China is not a member of UNCLOS. This reflects not only his weak position regarding the South China Sea issue, probably reflects his ignorance about important things about international relations. Indeed, no less than Justice Carpio would have to remind him, China is a member of UNCLOS. And of course, consultation away. So, of course, there's an expectation, and of course, he had announced this, that he would follow the policy of President Duterte, which my colleague Jay Batumbakal argued that, in fact, his approach is more fatalistic and defeatist than the outgoing president. And it's because of the fact that he followed the mantra of the current president. There's no point in challenging China because this would lead into war. And of course, he added another caveat, which I don't think is making the armed forces of the Philippines very happy. The Philippine military would have to go back to internal defense. When I first heard it, my initial reaction, my goodness, this person might even want to return back to the martial law era. The military would use again, I'm a product. I still remember the martial law period. The military again would be used to, maintain, the authoritarian regime that of course happened when martial law was declared in 1972. Does he have this in his mind? I'm just playing with ideas. Those who fought the dictatorship in the 1970s and 1980s cannot help but think about this. And I happen to be one of them, given my age. So, the issue here of continuity. When we talk about continuing the policy of the Duterte administration, what should he, or anyone else who would, be elected as our 17th president would have to take into account? So what do we mean by continuity? And that means, of course, reviewing what has been the foreign policy of the country since 2016. So at the onset, of course, is his policy of appeasement, which he announced when he was in Beijing. I'm separating from the United States, China, and Russia. Here I come. A question, of course, U.S. security guarantee. You know, the United States would never provide us assistance. Look what the United States did during the Scarborough Shoal incident. And of course, the Duterte administration accepted China's core procedural norms. This is the very essence of the appeasement policy of this administration. A number of academics, analysts like me would say it's hedging. No, it's not. It's appeasement because this administration adopted the core procedures. What are the core procedures? Number one, bilateral issues, setting aside the sovereignty issues, trying to move third parties away from this, the management of this dispute, talks of joint development. I would emphasize talks because joint development has not yet happened. And of course, the fact that increasing bilateral trade would eventually, of course, resolve the dispute. Okay, so what happened? In 2018, there was a not dramatic, but an incremental shift in Philippine policy towards China from, appeasement to what I would consider limited balancing. It's part of a learning process, as any administration would do. It took the Duterte administration about from 2016, 2017, 2018 to realize that appeasement would not simply work. So the next president would have to elect, as much as possible, should not go to this, what I would call learning process, assuming that China is our best friend, that by simply befriending China, this would manage and resolve the dispute. This is, of course, a very dangerous action, and it's no less than the Duterte administration realized this. So this shift can be partly attributed to the Philippines military's position. The military, of course, has always been suspicious of China. It's always, of course, always been protective of the relationship with the United States, primarily because of its long association with the U.S. military in terms of the alliance. It's one important institution that, of course, has been challenged the appeasement policy of the Duterte administration. We could talk about instances of how the military has basically come out. And of course, the AFP is suspicious of Chinese funding of the Philippine infrastructure projects, like what happened near, an infrastructure project in an area where I'm residing in Cavite City about the airport, which would, of course, close the access of the Philippine Navy to the Manila Bay. And of course, it's also stemmed from its mandate to protect the countries in the face, of course, of China's aggressive action in the South China Sea. So the Duterte administration has not aligned, in a way, subordinated Philippine foreign policy to China's revisionist agenda of course, maritime expansion, simply because of the fact that we are putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position. The Duterte realized lately, after about 3 years, that by appeasing and expanding power, we accept greater vulnerability and, of course, an erroneous and false hope that China would treat us equally, that China would try to mitigate the harsh edge of its maritime expansion in the South China Sea. That, it cut a deal with China because China will treat the Philippines as co-equal. This is simply far from the truth, and this is something we will be discussing later. So there's evident in some of the policies. Number one, of course, is decision to continue the funding of the Armed Forces of the Philippines modernization program, downgrading but keeping our alliance intact with the United States, shown by his decision to, of course, terminate the abrogation process. Remember, he abrogated the BFA in 2020, but eventually in July 30, 2021, he decided to terminate the abrogation process, and of course, maintaining our security partnership with Japan and Australia. So what do we mean by current strategy of limited balancing? Stems, of course, from the realization after 3 years of appeasement that the policy of appeasement puts us in a very disadvantageous position. The weaker party puts strategic stake in the hands of a more powerful country, which is China, which of course has not mitigated his hostile view of the Philippines. From the Chinese perspective, whether you appease China or you challenge China, you're just incidental. You're just blocking China's maritime expansion way into what we call the first island chain. A policy of limited hard balancing requires accepting that China is a major economic and military power in the region. But we have to maintain economic and diplomatic relations with this emerging power. However, we must mitigate any adverse externalities of this geopolitical reality. Chinese assertiveness, coercive behavior, territorial expansion, by developing military capabilities and, of course, maintaining countervailing coalition of other major powers, including, of course, our alliance with the United States and with our security partnership with Japan, Australia, and, of course, the European Union. The policy was not well thought out by this administration. This was a result of the defense, military, and foreign affairs establishment questioning this appeasement policy and this administration's belated realization after 3 years that it has to devise something, given the fact that whether you befriend China or not, China would pursue its, of course, ambition. Furthermore, this policy is based on finding the equilibrium between managing China's maritime expansion in the West Philippine Sea and, of course, growing U.S. presence in Southeast Asia and increasing involvement in the dispute. That's why, ironically, despite its appeasement policy, since 2016, Secretary Lorenzana in 2018 had to seek, a clearer security guarantee from the United States. I don't know if you remember this. That's why in March 2019, you have, of course, then Secretary Michael Pompeo, again, reiterating the security guarantee as provided by Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Now, this is the last part. So the next task of the president is, you can talk about this is one thing I would do, so forth and so on. But once you are in position, that's where you realize that your options are actually limited by a number of both internal and external realities. So on the outside, Vice President Robredo, and of course, the son of the dictator have opposing foreign policy agenda. The Vice President is calling for a return to a stronger relationship with the Philippines and its strategic security allies. And he's also, very emphatic about the fact that, yes, we can have a joint development with China, but China must, of course, acknowledge the arbitral ruling. The other candidates basically are articulating the same view. Bongbong Marcos, on the other hand, plans to continue as President Duterte's seemingly China's friendly external policy. And of course, and this is something that makes the armed forces of the Philippines a bit uneasy. Returning back the armed forces of the Philippines from focusing on external defense, which began during the term of the late President Benigno Aquino III. In 2012, after Scarborough Shoal, and of course, when the Philippine Congress passed the revised modernization law and the acquisition. So this is, he said that, have to return back to what we basically call those who are products of the martial law period, like me, still remember the constabulary, the Philippine constabulary. Younger people now do not remember this, but we still remember, when martial law was declared. In 1972, those who are here in Manila would still remember the uniforms of the Metrocom. And if you're a political activist like me in UP during that time, you cannot help but see the blue Toyota Corolla cars of the Metrocom following you when you're about to go home to your, coming from UP, then going home, or seeing those blue cars parked near your house during the dark days of the martial law period. Again, this campaign had reminded me of those dark days, those challenging days as a political activist in the martial law period. So whoever would win would have to understand this constraint. Number one, of course, a Philippine military that is, of course, conscious of its alliance with the United States and, of course, has a corporate interest in continuing the modernization program. So just in case the son of the former dictator gets elected, he will have some issues with the Philippine military. President Duterte initially said to the Philippine military, I want you to go back to internal security. Last year, he just signed the second stage of the, Horizon 2 of the modernization program of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So who will ever be elected as the president will have to take into account that the fact that the momentum is there to effect the modernization program of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And this is where I believe we would fit in. President Duterte had to take into account a vibrant civil society that is always suspicious of China, as proven by the surveys, by both, I won't mention that surveys outfit, and of course, the social weather. I will not mention the other one, but they have been always consistent. Filipinos are generally suspicious of China. They're favorable to the United States. And of course, one of the reasons that possibly forced President Duterte to adopt a limited balancing policy is the criticism coming from the civil society led by Justice Carpio and of course, former Secretary Albert Del Rosario in criticizing his appeasement policy. So this should continue, whether we have Vice President Robredo becoming president, the civil society, a dynamic civil society, focus on, of course, the importance, emphasizing the importance of the West Philippine Sea issue should always be there. Then, of course, the alliance, and of course, a key challenge. If again, the son of the dictator would adopt his China-friendly foreign policy and adopt the mantra of President Duterte that China is the best friend of the Philippines, is of course the fact that a military powerful China is simply determined to defend its position and interests. It has, of course, from a Chinese perspective, the South China Sea issue is a core interest, where of course there would be no compromise. So the next president, aside from addressing those constraints, would have to address, of course, this delicate balancing games, two-level balancing games, relying on China's preferred means of managing the dispute, which I mentioned earlier, but at the same time developing the means to challenge and mitigate Chinese coercive actions by upholding the ruling, building the capability of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Coast Guard, fostering closer defense ties with our traditional allies, taking advantage of economic opportunities from China, given its economic power, while harnessing growing U.S. strategic presence in Indo-Pacific region and involvement. Balancing and addressing these constraints would require, of course, moral courage, and of course, dedication, and more importantly, experience. I can only think of one candidate who has, of course, the moral courage, moral integrity, and more importantly, experience in government to be able to guide the Philippines as we navigate the very dangerous waters of the 21st century. So my last slide is, I refer to the Greeks. When the Greeks talk about strategy, they don't talk about a male god. Rather, they refer to, of course, if you're interested in my article, the Greeks are basically would attribute wisdom and strategy to a female goddess of Athena. And I believe that we need the guidance of Athena in a form of, a female candidate to guide us in this very dangerous waters of the 21st century. If you're interested in what I say, it just came out in a online publication in the City University of Hong Kong. Thank you very much for your attention. Again, this time we have to rely on an Athena rather than on, the Romans have this god of wine, Bacchus, always drinking wine, but in this case, probably cocaine. We don't need that kind of a person. I end here.
All right. Ayan. Narinig po natin si Professor De Castro. Maraming salamat ho, Professor. So much to digest. Ngayon naman, pakinggan natin ang sasabihin ni Justice Carpio. Justice Carpio, it's your turn na po.
Magandang umaga sa inyo lahat. Pleasant morning to our friends in media. Our topic is what is the fate of the West Philippine Sea under the next president? To answer this question, we have to look at the present policy of President Duterte on the West Philippine Sea. After assuming office, President Duterte said, "I will set aside the arbitral award I will freeze it. I will do nothing. That was his policy. Then he said to the Philippine Navy publicly, patrol only up to the territorial sea in the West Philippine Sea. Do not go beyond the territorial sea. Do not patrol the EEZ of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. Of course, this is against the Constitution because the Constitution states that the state shall protect its marine wealth in its exclusive economic zone and reserve its use exclusively to Filipinos. Then President Duterte said, President Xi Jinping will protect me against any coup by the armed forces of the Philippines. And he's implied that the Chinese forces in the Spratlys are there to protect him. Imagine that. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the Philippines seeking protection from a foreign leader against his own military. It's unheard of. Then President Duterte said in his zona, I am inutil when it comes to defending the West Philippine Sea. He said it publicly, I am inutil. The commander-in-chief of the armed forces saying, I am inutil in defending the West Philippine Sea. That means he will not defend our sovereign island territories, our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Here is the commander-in-chief in dereliction of his duty to defend our territory and maritime zones. Then, in another zona, President Duterte said, China is in possession of the West Philippine Sea, which is totally wrong. I mean, it's false, no? China is not in possession. He conceded the West Philippine Sea already to China. Then President Duterte said that Chinese fishermen can fish in Philippine EEZ in the West Philippine Sea, which is against the Constitution because the Constitution says the marine wealth in our EEZ is reserved exclusively to Filipinos. So that is the present policy of President Duterte on the West Philippine Sea. Now, if Ferdinand Marcos Jr. wins the presidency, what will be his policy on the West Philippine Sea? Well, he already said it. He said, I will continue President Duterte's policy on the West Philippine Sea. He will continue this inutil policy. But it's even worse because Marcos Jr. said, he announced publicly, that arbitration is no longer an arbitration if there is only one party. So it's no longer available to us. That arbitration is no longer an arbitration if there's only one party. So it's no longer available to us. The arbitration is not available to us because we were the only party to an arbitration. China did not participate. Marcos Jr. actually adopts the Chinese position that the arbitration has no legal effect because China did not participate in the arbitration. There was only one party to the arbitration, the Philippines, and Marcos Jr. has completely adopted this position. So, the Marcos Jr.'s position is worse than the Duterte position. It's worse because Marcos Jr. rejects the arbitral award and Duterte at least only froze the arbitral award to be resurrected at a future date. Marcos Jr.'s position is a betrayal of the country because he has completely sided with China that the arbitral award is null and void and thus useless. It's a total rejection of the Philippine position and a total adoption of the Chinese position. This is In wartime, this is treason. In peacetime, this is betrayal of the nation, of the highest order. So if elected, Marcos Jr. will be the first head of state to reject an arbitral award that is overwhelmingly in favor of his country. In practical terms, Marcos Jr.'s rejection of the arbitral award will concede to China a maritime area larger than the total land area of the Philippines. Our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea is larger than the total land area of all the islands of the Philippines put together. Marcos Jr. will be conceding to China all the fish, oil, gas, and other mineral resources in this huge maritime area. All these natural resources belong to the present and future generations of Filipinos. Instead of protecting these natural resources for Filipinos, Marcos Jr. will be giving them away for free to China. This is betrayal of national interest of the highest order. Now, Senator Amy Marcos also said, and I quote, "Kasalanan natin, bakit natin inabla ang China?" So, Amy Marcos is even faulting the Philippines for defending the West Philippine Sea before an international tribunal, where the Philippines won a landmark victory against China. Kasalanan daw natin for defending what is ours, what belongs to the Filipino people. Clearly, the Marcos family will deliver the West Philippine Sea to China against Philippine national interest based on these public admissions of Marcos Jr. and Amy Marcos. Now, in contrast, under a Robredo presidency, it will be completely different. Robredo said she will uphold and enforce the arbitral award in accordance with international law. She will follow the rule of law, that is international law and the Philippine Constitution, in enforcing our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Robredo said she will seek support of our friends and allies in protecting our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea in accordance with international law and the Philippine Constitution. She will maintain trade and economic relations with China without compromising our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. And she will agree to cooperation with China in exploiting the oil and gas in the West Philippine Sea only if China concedes and recognizes our sovereign rights. When China recognizes the arbitral award, then we can deal with China. Which is, I agree completely with VP Leni Robredo's position. In conclusion, under a Marcos Jr. presidency, the Philippines will finally lose the West Philippine Sea to China. Under a Robredo presidency, the Philippines will succeed in defending our exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea against China. This is what is at stake on the West Philippine Sea in the May 9, 2022 elections. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po, Justice Carpio. Ayan, malinaw na sinabi ni Justice Carpio ang posisyon ni Marcos kung sakaling siya maging presidente, iririgalo niya sa China ang West Philippine Sea. When a president is supposed to defend, it's a president's responsibility to defend our territories. Pero ang gagawin ni Marcos, iririgalo niya sa China. Ganong kalinaw ang kanyang posisyon. So ngayon po, dumako na tayo sa ating open forum. Bago lahat, ito yung house rules natin. Sa mga katanungan, dalawang paraan po. Just raise your hand at hintayin pong tawagin ang inyong pangalan o isulat po ang inyong katanungan sa ating chat box sa Zoom. Para sa mga nagsusubaybay sa ating FB Live at YouTube, gamitin po ang comment section para sa inyong mga tanong at sisikapin naming ibato sa ating mga panelists ito. Okay. Ang una nating tanong, let's see. All right. for our two panelists today, ano ang pwedeng magawa ng isang karaniwang Pilipino para maiparating sa gobyerno na hindi tayo dapat patuloy na magpasakop sa China? Professor De Castro, Justice Carpio, anyone could answer this one.
Let me answer that first. That's the question that should be asked by everyone, and the answer is very clear. What can every Filipino do to defend the West Philippine Sea? Do not vote a candidate for president who will give away the West Philippine Sea to China. Vote for the candidate who will defend the West Philippine Sea against Chinese encroachment. Vote for a president who will enforce the arbitral award. Do not vote for a president who said publicly na talo na tayo. Wala na tayong laban sa China. Wag na tayo bumili ng mga warship or jet planes. Kasalanan natin bakit tayo nag-file ng arbitration case. Bakit, do not vote for people like this because they will give away the West Philippine Sea. And the power is within our hands. Vote for the president who will defend the West Philippine Sea. And that is how every Filipino can defend the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Okay, may I add, aside from what Justice Carpio said about voting, I think it's also important that we have to think in terms of after this election, the importance of the civil society, like maintaining a movement, which I think Sambayan could provide, whether, of course, who will be elected, whether it's the son of the dictator or President Robredo. We need a very vibrant civil society movement that would advise. The election has basically provided us the initial momentum. And of course, we have some pioneer. We have, of course, leaders like Justice Carpio, Secretary Albert De Losario, and others who would be here. So this is something very important. We should ensure that there will be a very active civil society movement that will, of course, advance the West Philippines Sea issue even beyond the May 9, 2022 election.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Professor De Castro and Justice Carpio. The next question: how else can we protect our own natural or mineral resources from being harvested by foreign-owned companies? And anyone could answer.
Yes, okay. Let me take a crack at that. Well, we have to send the Coast Guard and the Navy to our exclusive economic zone because you cannot catch poachers unless you are there. If we follow Duterte, he's saying do not go beyond the territorial sea, do not go to our EEZ. How can we protect our fish in the EEZ if we are not sending our Coast Guard, our patrol boats to the West Philippine Sea? So we must send our Coast Guard and our patrol ships, Navy ships there. We have to have a presence in the West Philippines. That's the only way. Because even if you have a reconnaissance, you see them getting your fish. If you are not there, you cannot stop them. So it's important. That's why UNCLOS gives us the right to patrol our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. And we have the option to conduct joint patrols with our allies, with our friends in the West Philippine Sea. But President Duterte has refused to send our Coast Guard or Navy in joint patrols in our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea. So if Marcos Jr. will follow that policy, we are dead. We will lose the West Philippine Sea. Thank you.
Let me just support Justice Carpio's position. I remember the former DCM of the Japanese embassy, Deputy Chief of Mission, is a good friend of mine. And he told me this: Japan was not very happy with the Duterte administration because, I don't know if you remember this, Japan provided us 12 multi-purpose patrol vessels to strengthen the Coast Guard. And in one forum where I was discussing the Duterte administration appeasement policy, I put the Coast Guard on the spot. Why aren't you sending those Coast Guard vessels? And they were told by Malacanang, those Coast Guard vessels could not be sent to the West Philippine Sea. They could be sent to Boracay, they could be sent to the Pacific portion of our waters, but not in the West Philippine Sea. So again, the leader would really matter when it comes to this issue. So we have to really elect somebody who has, of course, the courage, the moral courage to take the risk in asserting our claim in the West Philippine Sea. And this will also involve not only sending the Navy and the Coast Guard, but also developing our maritime forces. So once we send them, they know that they have the support of the Filipino people, not only in terms of the moral, but more importantly, the material support.
All right. Thank you very much. Here's a question from Facebook. Marami ang nagsasabi, mahina si VP Lenny dahil babae siya. Kailangan natin ng lalaki para matapang, para ipaglaban ang ating teritoryo sa West Philippine Sea. Pero hindi ho ba dahil sa stand ni Marcos, dahil sa kanyang plano, siya nga yung mas duwag?
Well, let me take a crack at that. Gender has nothing to do with it. Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister, was very well respected. She defended her country. I mean, there are many examples of women, and we have Gabriela Silang. I mean, we have our own women heroes. I mean, in this day and age, gender will not matter because it's all in the head, it's all in the heart, it's all in the soul, it's all in the character. Even if you are a male, but if you are a coward, if you are selling your EEZ to China, if you refuse to defend the EEZ to China, katulad ngayon, you have a male president, ang yabang. Kaya lang pagdating sa China, tumatakbo, ayaw lumaban, luluhod. Hindi pwede. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. It depends on moral courage, moral character. Thank you.
I could cite 3 female leaders who showed toughness when it comes to foreign policy. First one I could remember is Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel. I don't know if you remember this. When the United States, this was in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Henry Kissinger was withholding the replenishment of Israeli war material. That was, of course, depleted at the onset of the war. Golda Meir threatened Israelis' main ally, the United States, and told them, "You want me to withdraw Jewish money from New York?" 24 hours later, Henry Kissinger ordered American transport planes to deliver those supplies to Israel. Number 2, the late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, when Argentina invaded the Falklands, Malvinas, she ordered a British task force to redeem British pride, despite, of course, initial hesitation of NATO and the United States. She was stopped. And of course, one, and I guess Germany misses her very much, Chancellor Merkel, who remained in power because at that time, before she retired, she was afraid that Donald Trump would destroy NATO. She said, "I could not retire because NATO needed a leader," and she provided that leadership until, of course, she got replaced. And of course, thank God, NATO is still here when, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine. And I guess in the case of Vice President Leni Robredo, her moral courage is shown by the fact that she decided to run despite the fact that the polls, the initial polls were saying that she has a very low rating. I think this is the best indication of her moral courage, which would be needed, especially in the light of, the president after, June 2022 would have to make tough choices. And I don't think the son of the dictator is capable of making those tough choices. And the last point I gave, that's why, again, I use Athena, right? Athena is a goddess of wisdom and strategy in warfare. So we always have to look at just remember the Greeks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Here we go. Worst case scenario na pwede pang mangyari hindi lang sa West Philippine Sea but to our economy under a Marcos Duterte administration. To both our guests, please.
Can you repeat that, Alvin?
What could be the worst case scenario na pwedeng mangyari sa West Philippine Sea and also in our economy under a Marcos Duterte administration?
Maybe Professor De Castro can answer it first.
I think I'll move away just from the West Philippine Sea to possible shock. Strategic economic shock that could be triggered by the escalation of conflict in Ukraine and Russia, and possibly also the conflict, what I call the strategic contagion hitting the region, especially, of course, a major crisis in the Taiwan Straits. Because a number of analysts and scholars are linking Russia's action to possible China's action here in the region. That's where, we need a tough leader who would have to make the right decision when we're confronted what I call the unforeseen strategic contagion that is, of course, generated by the war in Europe.
Yeah, let me add to that, Alvi. In the West Philippine Sea, if we do nothing, we will run out of gas in Malampaya in 2 years, 2 to 3 years. Malampaya supplies 40% of our energy requirement in Luzon. And if we don't get new source of gas, which is Reed Bank, the replacement of Malampaya is Reed Bank. If we do not develop Reed Bank, because we are afraid of developing Reed Bank, then we will have 12 to 14 hours of brownout in Luzon. Factories will close, malls will close, schools will close, offices will close. You cannot even work from home because there's no power. You cannot have Zoom meetings because there's no internet, no power. It will be terrible. It will be worse than the pandemic. Look at Malaysia. Malaysia decided to drill more oil and gas fields in their exclusive economic zone. China said, do not do that. China sent its Coast Guard, but Malaysia persisted. They sent their Navy also, their Coast Guard. And Malaysia was able to complete their drilling because it was in their national interest. China could not do anything. So Malaysia was able to complete its drilling. Indonesia did the same. Indonesia started its survey in the Natuna Island for gas, oil and gas. The Chinese said, do not do that because that's within the 9-dash line. But Indonesia persisted. China sent its survey ships, it's a Coast Guard vessel, but Indonesia sent its Coast Guard vessels, also its Navy, and Indonesia was able to complete the survey. In our case, Duterte said, do not send our survey ship to Reed Bank. He just said it recently. He stopped Forum Energy from sending. Forum Energy already contracted, paid down payment for the survey ship to go to Reed Bank, and at the last minute, Duterte said, do not go there because China told me that, not to go there. He allowed himself to be bullied. Malaysia refused to be bullied. They completed their drilling. China refused to be bullied. They completed their survey. But here is a male president, Duterte, macho daw siya, but he said, told our foreign energy, do not send the survey ship. What will happen to us if we don't have gas to replace Malampaya? We will have to import LNG. Very expensive because we have several gas-fired plants in Luzon, in Batangas. So where is the sense of protecting national interest there? That's none at all. He is kowtowing. He is kneeling before China. And Malaysia has shown the way. Do not be intimidated. And they completed. And Malaysia does not even have an arbitral award. We have an arbitral award. Malaysia does not have a mutual defense treaty with the US or with any nuclear armed power. We have a treaty. And the US have said the West Philippine Sea, the South China Sea is part of the coverage of the mutual defense treaty. If your Coast Guard ship or Philippine Navy ship is attacked there in Reed Bank, that will trigger the mutual defense treaty. You can invoke the mutual defense treaty. So why are we so afraid? Here is a male president, alpha daw siya, but he doesn't want to send our survey ship to Reed Bank. It's terrible. And here is a presidential candidate. He said, I will follow the policy of Duterte. It will be terrible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Here's a question from Noel De Leon. Ipaglaban natin ang West Philippine Sea. Kaya ba natin to? Kahit sa pakipagdigmaan sa ngayon na mahina pa tayo sa militar kaysa sa China.
Let me answer that. When we defend our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea, it does not mean that you go to war. Malaysia is defending their EEZ. Indonesia is defending their EEZ. Even Vietnam is defending their EEZ. And there is no war. We went to the Hague to have the 9th Line of China declared void. There was no war. We are just fooling ourselves if we convince ourselves that to defend our EEZ means going to war. It does not follow. And China doesn't want to go to war with us because we have a mutual defense treaty. Whoever is saying that it means war doesn't know what he's talking about. Thank you.
I'll support Justice Carpio. This is basically how the Chinese are playing the game, no? Threatening President Duterte with war, knowing for the fact that, immediately we would be intimidated. But the Chinese game plan is based on Sun Tzu, the art of war, to win without actually fighting. So China would create this scenario that they would wage war against us. And once, of course, we fall into this trap, that's it. It's over. And of course, just like what Justice Carpio mentioned, we could rely, of course, we don't want it to happen. China also doesn't want it to happen. So it's a bluff, a brinkmanship game. So what has been proven is that a number of countries did not fall to this Chinese stratagem of threatening us with war by, simply with the hope that it will win without actually fighting. But it doesn't mean that we should not do something about it. No, for one thing, we should also defend our, develop our capabilities, limited, not offensive, something that the Ukrainians have learned, that at least you prepared for any eventuality. Plus, of course, the importance of our strategic relations with our only treaty ally and, of course, other strategic partners, Australia, Japan, the European Union. But of course, they will only provide us assistance if we develop our very own capability. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. For our, this is going to be our last question. Of course, for both Professor De Castro and Justice Carpio. Why do you think VP Lenny can assert our claim in the West Philippine Sea?
Maybe Professor De Castro can answer it first. Thank you.
Well, she already mentioned it, although I am always saying that we have to take their statements right now with a grain of salt. She mentioned it. But I would settle more for the fact that she has shown moral courage. She has shown really commitment in terms of what she's saying. And this is also shown by the fact that her campaign has also triggered a movement. Now, you will not be able to trigger a movement unless you have this moral character. What we're seeing right now is, a movement. So on the basis of this, I think, plus of course a support of that movement, even after the election, would push her to really defend our interests in the West Philippines. Well, she would do it, but let us make sure na hindi siya nag-iisa when it comes to defending our territorial rights in the West Philippine Sea issue.
Let me add to that, Alvi. There's no doubt that VP Lenny, if elected president, will defend our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Because defending our sovereign rights involve only using international law, using the rule of law. She will not go to war because it's crazy to go to war when you can do it without going to war. And this will be in accordance with international law. There's so many ways to enforce our sovereign rights by just following international law, by following non-aggressive actions. Like, for example, I have said this before, the first thing to do is to get everybody in ASEAN to submit their overlapping claims. Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines have overlapping claims. We agree to submit this to arbitration. Invite China to join. China will not join. And among ourselves, we have settled already our overlapping claims. These are just boundary claims. And so we have isolated China. We use the rule of law there, UNCLOS. Then we will have a convention using that arbitration award that in the EEZ and exclusive and the extended continental shelves of these ASEAN states, there is freedom of navigation and overflight. You can conduct naval drills in accordance with international law, in accordance with UNCLOS. We invite US, EU, Japan, Australia, Indonesia to join that convention. And they will join because that is their policy. They've said it. So the world will support us in that convention. So by convention, the EEZ of Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei will be recognized by these countries without going to arbitration against China. So China will be isolated. We can file our extended continental shelf claim of the coast of Luzon against China. And we will win that because the 9-dash line has already been invalidated. So there are many ways of doing this, enforcing our sovereign rights without going to war. It's all legal because war is outlawed. Our constitution says the Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy. We cannot even go to war to enforce our claim. It's against our constitution. And it's also against the UN Charter. The UN Charter says all disputes between states must be settled by peaceful means, first by negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. It's illegal against international law to go to war to settle a dispute. So whoever talks of war doesn't understand the international legal system, doesn't understand our constitution. So VP Lenny Robredo, if elected, will enforce our rights because all these measures are legal under international law and under our constitution. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for all your very clear and pragmatic answers to the questions that were raised. Now, may we have your final messages? And let's start with Professor De Castro.
Well, in the 21st century, given the developments, happening out there, you have, of course, the war between Russia and Ukraine. You have the possibility that this war would escalate. There's also a possibility that this war would also affect developments in the region. not only in the West Philippine Sea, but also in Taiwan. We need a leader, a true leader would have to navigate the country. A leader who has, of course, moral courage, dedication to serve, and of course, more importantly, the ability to make decisive and risky decisions. Now, I don't find this in the son of the dictator. For him, everything has been provided to him. And of course, it's how also he views his campaign. It's driven primarily by the fact that he wants to recover the wealth that his family lost and the power they lost after, of course, that historic event in 1986 in EDSA. So I don't think he has this character. Only one person has his character of course, moral courage, dedication to serve the Filipino people, and of course, the capacity to make decisive decision, which she showed when she made the decision to run despite all odds. I don't need to mention her name.
Thank you. On my part, I have always been asked by fellow Filipinos, what can ordinary Filipinos do to protect the West Philippine Sea? And the answer is simple. If you want to protect the West Philippine Sea, do not vote for Marcos Jr. If you want to protect the West Philippine Sea, vote for VP Leni Robredo. And that power is in your hands in 3 days' time. Because when we vote to choose our president, we are also voting whether we will defend the West Philippine Sea or not, whether we will give away the West Philippine Sea to China or protect it for our future generations of Filipinos. That is what is at stake this May 9. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Justice Carpio. Professor De Castro, thank you for joining us this morning. At maraming salamat ulit sa lahat ng dumalo sa ating tapatan ngayong linggo. Antabayanan po ang announcement natin sa ating susunod na tapatan. At bago po tayo magtapos, ipinapaalala po ng isang bayan na bantayan ang ating mga boto sa pamamagitan ng pagda-download ng Hope App. Hope App. Simple lamang ang paraan. Una, magpunta kayo sa Google Play Store o kaya sa App Store para sa iPhone at hanapin or i-key in ang Hope Watch 2022. That's just one word, no space. Hope Watch 2022. I-download yung app at i-install ito sa inyong phone. Tapos mag-register kayo, i-navigate ang Hope App. Magagamit mo ito para mag-report ng anumang anomalya sa presinto mo sa darating na halalan. Dahil mahalaga na bumoto ka at mabilang ang tama ang iyong boto. So muli po, maraming salamat sa lahat, lalong-lalo na po sa mga kapatid natin sa media. God bless po sa inyong lahat. Magkikita-kita tayo sa susunod na tapatan. Have a safe election. Good morning, everyone. Thank you.
Nakasalalay ang kulay ng bukas, malarosas, maliwanag ba o kulimlim lang ang nakikita? Paninindigan, yung ipaglaban, pamilya, kaibigan, mahal mo sa buhay, ikaw, ako, tayong magsisimula ang daan upang maging isang bayan. Isang puso, pamumuno na tapat, ang lahat ay angat sa ating bayan. Pilipino, kinabukasan Lenny Kiko, ipanalo natin to. isang puso, pamumuno na tapat, ang lahat ay aangat sa ating bayang Pilipino. Kinabukasan